Over the weekend, viral video was circulating of a group of Black Lives Matter protesters occupying a roadway and blocking traffic in Plano, Texas, with one police officer standing watch without intervention, until an angry driver got out of his car and approached the protesters, and a brief and minor physical interaction happened before the lone officer intervened to remove the driver from the situation, but not the protester street blockade. And the accusations that followed were police enabling of the mob, even police siding with the mob, and assault with a deadly weapon. At one point in the video, it sure looks a lot like one of the protesters is pointing a handgun at the pissed off driver guy, though that claim is now officially disputed, outright denied by the Plano Police Department. As of Monday, we have a lot more information in this case, or at least a lot more claims, though many of them are now conflicting. But what is clear is that despite what looks like an awful lot of law breaking on the part of the protesters, the man who got out of his car and approached them and demanded that they move is now the only one facing charges, an assault by contact charge, a low-level misdemeanor in Texas, for this moment when he tried to slap a phone out of the hand of a woman recording him. And after that charging decision, we now have dueling statements of fact from Texas law enforcement agencies. The Plano Police Department released a statement saying this is all just a big misunderstanding. The video doesn't show what you think it shows. Social media overreaction and mischaracterization has made people believe this scene was something that it wasn't. In response, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton released his own statement, accusing the Plano police chief of inconsistent communication, excusing the mob, and implicitly helping to turn Texas into Portland. It's always interesting when there's fairly clear video of a crime and two different people watching that video come to polar opposite conclusions about who's the criminal in the scenario. So let's see if we can iron out the details. Not that it has any criminal implications, but I always like to know why the protesters are in the streets in the first place. This time, it was a protest about the death of Marvin Scott, a man with reported mental health issues who was arrested for marijuana possession and died in police custody after some sort of physical struggle with corrections officers at the jail. The accusations are those officers improperly restrained him, they put a hood over his head, they put him in a chokehold, they pepper sprayed him, and the altercation resulted in Marvin Scott's death. This was March 14th. 7 corrections officers were fired and an 8th resigned after the incident. Investigation is ongoing and criminal charges remain possible. So that's why these protesters occupied this Plano street. That's why this guy got out of his car to confront them. And that's what leads us to this statement from the Plano Police Department that urges you not to believe your lying eyes. The Plano Police Department disputes almost every conclusion you reach from watching the video. It says police were called originally for a traffic signal malfunction, not for protesters in the street, but protesters were in the roadway when one police officer arrived. Only one arrived due to high call volumes, but that officer did call for backup immediately. The statement says that officer did not witness the assault of the man trying to slap the phone out of that woman's hand, and that what appears to be a gun in the hand of a protester pointing at that man in response is not in fact a gun. It's an electronic control device, or a stun gun. This according to both officer confirmation and photo evidence they provide. Plano police say their priority throughout was to de-escalate, which they say they successfully did. Nobody got hurt, no property was damaged, and the roadway was clear 7 minutes after that officer arrived. So shame on those falsely reporting on the incident, and shame on you for believing it. Except none of us relied on reporting. None of us relied on someone's verbal characterization of what happened, at least not primarily. We relied on what we can see happen in the video. And frankly, much of this statement doesn't totally square with what we can see in the original video and what else we can see with just a little more digging. I find it very difficult to believe that this officer didn't witness the physical altercation, considering literally 5 seconds before it happened, the man trying to get the protesters out of the road was screaming at the officer to help him. And then, frustrated with the cops' inaction, the man walks over to the protesters, and that's when the physical interaction of both the hand slap and the weapon pointing happen. The only ways for this officer not to have witnessed that interaction would be either that he turned his head 180 degrees, which I doubt, or if, as the statement says, someone obstructed his view, but nobody does. We can see the man walk straight from the officer over to the crowd and nobody breaks that field of vision. I'm also not entirely convinced that the Plano police are correct about this pointed weapon for a few reasons. Yes, they have this photograph. Yes, it is the same guy in the same outfit in the video, but is it the same weapon? I know it's low res and it's far from conclusive, but the weapon in the photo appears to have a much shorter, stubbier grip than the weapon pointed in the video. It could be a shadow, but the two weapons just don't look the same dimensionally to me. Additionally, this style of stun gun has a trigger hole through the whole weapon frame. I can't see such a trigger hole on the one pointed in the video. Pair that with inconsistent statements about the weapon from the Plano police. According to the Texas Attorney General, the Plano police chief first said it was a pepper ball gun, and then later said it was a taser or a stun gun. But if police at the scene confirmed what it was, as the statement from the Plano Police Department says they did, then why all the confusion? If the police at the scene confirmed what this weapon is within 7 minutes, then why do we still have miscommunication about it days later? As far as the de-escalation that this statement references, is it because of quality police work that this incident was minimized, or is it just because the mob got its way? Because the same mob that was blocking the streets without challenge just pushed this guy back with a police officer's assistance. Of course a mob is momentarily satisfied if a mob gets its way like this. The so-called de-escalation that we just watched could be just as accurately described as a lawless mob exerting its will. And I know, if that mob can push back that driver, they can just as easily push back a lone police officer too. I get it. There are resource realities in play, and this officer has to wait for those resources to support him. But that doesn't excuse any of the criminality we're watching. Because that's the thing about these explanations from the Plano Police Department. Even if they're true, do any of these distinctions actually matter? They still don't explain why only the guy who was trying to clear the roadway obstruction has been charged, and nobody else who visibly committed a crime. Even if this officer didn't witness the specifics of these crimes, they're all on video and available for review later. Even if that pointed weapon is a stun gun and not a real gun, you can't just point gun lookalikes or deadly weapons of any variety at people on the street. I can't point a model gun at people on the street and then say, haha, just kidding, it's a plastic toy, joke's on you. That's not the standard for assault. The standard for assault is whether a victim reasonably perceives a threat of immediate physical harm. And if this thing is pointed at me, I'm definitely thinking immediate physical harm. And besides, it's not even a toy. It's a serious weapon in its own right. That's why in many jurisdictions, police are authorized to respond to taser or stun gun threats with lethal force. The Plano police claim that use of stun gun force was justified because the guy was defending that woman from the phone slap, but there are some problems with treating that claim as legally obvious. It is true that Texas has broad self-defense laws and would generally cover someone responding to even the lowest level misdemeanor use of force with potentially deadly force, including in defense of others, not just in defense of self. So if the driver just came out of nowhere to attack the protester, that interpretation of Texas law could be upheld. But is that what happened? Was this just a guy aggressively attacking a rando on the street who had done nothing wrong? Texas self-defense laws do not cover the actions of someone who provoked the attack. And yes, provocation can be strictly verbal. Texas self-defense laws also do not cover someone who is engaged in criminal behavior before or during the interaction. In this case, the guy pointing the stun gun has at least one, and likely both, strikes against him. Leading up to that physical altercation, the guy who ultimately points the stun gun is seen agitating the driver, aggressively obstructing him personally, yelling at him personally. He has to be held back from trying to interfere with the driver's communication with the police officer. And even if stun gun guy is just very sincerely trying to tell the driver to have a great day, the indisputable fact of this scenario is stun gun guy is committing a crime the entire time. Obstructing a roadway without legal privilege or authority is a crime in Texas, so everyone this driver was interacting with was engaged in an ongoing crime. Or at least I'm confident in assuming these protesters didn't have legal authorization to block that road, considering they were removed mere minutes later. If they were authorized to be there, they wouldn't have been removed. And the Plano Police Department wouldn't be bragging about successfully removing them. And it's not just the physical obstruction alone either. If Plano police asked the protesters to move and they didn't, that's another component of a crime. So did this officer ask these protesters to move? There's no mention of that in the Plano police statement, and if Plano police didn't make that simple request, they have no business boasting about their de-escalation skill. Asking nicely is the ultimate de-escalation tactic, and forgoing that option would be a failure to attempt the easiest and most basic way to try to get this situation under control, and a way to bring charges to anyone in the mob who refuses. Now, to be as fair to the Plano police as I possibly can, it's not totally unreasonable to say that that driver's swipe at that lady's phone is a low-level crime, the lowest level crime in Texas. In fact, it's not serious, but it is a physical aggression that's not strictly defensive in nature, granted. However, to be as fair as possible to everybody else, that driver, all the other drivers, the public at large, it is totally unreasonable to say this entire scene contains one and only one crime. There is no objective standard by which you can say that this is a violent aggression towards someone committing a crime that doesn't also mean that this is a violent aggression towards someone committing a crime. And that's just the surface. It's not just pointing a potentially deadly weapon at a single guy. It's obstructing travelers in their lawful business. It's generally terrorizing the public into bowing to your politics. These are much more serious crimes with much more serious implications than swatting a phone out of someone's hands, though that may be wrong to do. And I thought maybe the Plano police chief has some sort of principled reason for believing otherwise, but then I immediately felt dumb for even offering that benefit of the doubt, because a 5-second search shows once again the much more likely and much more common explanation for this nonsense.
Plano's police chief marched with protesters for hours yesterday in West Plano.
For a second straight day, Plano's police chief joined protests for racial justice.
It helps to reinforce what we try to tell them, that we too see his death as a tragedy.
Is the Plano police chief a neutral servant of the public and the law first, or is he an activist? If he has such little respect for himself and his community that he teams up with people accusing him of running a Klansman organization, that's a pretty good indicator of where his sympathies, his commitments, and his priorities are. When the guy in charge of protecting the individual from the mob is part of the mob himself, this is just a game of mob warfare. And however philosophically bankrupt that game may be, it's still a game that has to be survived. If these are the rules that are insisted upon us, we can argue that these rules are morally bankrupt, and we should, but we also need a contingency plan, which means we're going to need a bigger mob. Next time, we need at least 100 of these guys, not just one. And if you think it'd be wrong to overwhelm others with brute force and exert your will upon them, please do go on. I'd love to hear more about this realization of philosophical principle. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Minds, that is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.